The command center hummed with the low, steady vibration of cooling fans, a sound that usually meant order. Tonight, it felt like a funeral dirge. Jacqueline sat motionless, her face illuminated by the rhythmic, cold light of a dozen flickering monitors. She leaned in, her fingers hovering inches from the console, tracing the data streams flowing from the Dragon sector. The lines of code cascaded downward, rapid and precise, until they hit the designated coordinates for Ruby. There, the stream died. A void. A perfect, unnatural silence in the digital flow. Jacqueline tapped the refresh key once, twice. The screen blinked, the cursor pulsed, but the data remained hollow. She pulled her hands back, the air in the room suddenly feeling too thin to breathe. She looked away from the monitor, scanning the empty rows of stations that stretched into the shadows. The silence was thick, pressing against her ears. She knew the protocol. If a sector went dark, it was meant to stay dark. But the void was too clean, too deliberate to be a glitch. She stood up, her boots echoing against the metal floor, and stared at the dark glass. Something had been erased. A notification tone chimed, cutting through the silence. A new file appeared on the primary display. Jacqueline opened it. The document was crisp, official, and final. It was a death certificate. Ruby, status, deceased. The words sat on the screen, static and cold. Jacqueline read the timestamp at the bottom. It claimed the report was generated 3 hours ago, yet the sector logs she had just reviewed showed no activity, no alerts, and no distress signals for the entire shift. She tapped the screen, scrolling through the diagnostic submenus. The report was a clean, hollow shell. No crash data, no recovery efforts, no witness testimonies. It was a narrative crafted to fill a gap that should not have existed. Her hands stopped shaking. The grief that had hollowed her out seconds ago hardened into something brittle and sharp. She stared at the digital signature at the bottom of the file, a generic authorization code from the Dragon High Command. It was too perfect. It was a lie. She pushed the chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the floor. She did not look at the monitors as screens anymore. She looked at them as a map of a crime scene. The official lie was meant to end the search, but it had only provided the first thread for her to pull. Jacqueline leaned back into the console, her pulse rhythmic and steady. The time for observation had passed. She reached for the primary input block, her fingers dancing across the keys with a frantic, precise speed. The screen erupted in a cascade of red warnings, demanding authorization codes she did not possess. She ignored the alerts, her eyes locked on the core security architecture. She needed to dig beneath the surface, into the architecture of the city itself. The system fought her, the cursors snapping back to their default positions as if trying to push her out. She slammed her palm against the command key, forcing a manual override that bypassed the standard verification protocols. The firewall groaned, a digital whine rising in pitch as she fed it a string of recursive logic loops. The screen flickered, the red warnings turning to a pale, pulsing amber. She held her breath, watching the progress bar crawl across the display. The system was trembling under the weight of her intrusion. She pressed one final sequence, a sequence she had memorized years ago during the academy drills, and waited. The heavy, encrypted locks holding the subdirectories in place began to slide away, revealing the jagged, raw data hidden beneath the polished interface. The final lock clicked open, the sound echoing in the empty room. A new interface bloomed on the display, stark and unadorned. It was a directory that did not exist in the public network. Jacqueline navigated through the folders, her breath hitching as she saw the file names. They were dated months after Ruby was supposedly lost. She tapped a log file, and a cascade of raw code flooded the monitor. It was not just a list of names. It was a comprehensive record of the Dragon sector's true activity. She compared the data to the official reports she had memorized. The casualties, the resource distributions, the ship movements. Every single entry was a mirror image of the truth, inverted to look like progress while masking a systemic void. The directory contained thousands of subfiles, each one a brick in a wall of misinformation. She pulled up a comparative analysis graph. The official narrative was a perfectly curated facade designed to hide the fact that the sector was not failing, but being hollowed out from within. She traced the lines of the code, her fingers hovering over the glass. Every lie had a structure, and she had just found the blueprint. The weight of the deception settled into the room, heavy and absolute. The directory held one final, protected file labeled with a string of impossible coordinates. Jacqueline dragged it into the viewer. The screen went black. For a heartbeat, there was only the hum of the cooling fans and the static of her own ragged breathing. Then, the feed sputtered to life. A binary star system occupied the frame, two suns locked in a slow, gravitational dance. A planet hung in the center, its surface a mosaic of barren rock and shifting shadows. The signal was weak, flickering with electromagnetic interference that threatened to wipe the image away. Jacqueline gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white as she adjusted the gain, fighting the distortion. She pushed the signal through a series of filters, sharpening the jagged edges of the light. The picture locked into focus. A landscape of rusted metal and forgotten machinery stretched across the horizon. It was a place that did not exist in any map, a graveyard of technology orbiting the twin stars. She leaned in, her forehead almost touching the glass, searching the terrain. The image was grainy, distorted by the light of the binary suns, but it was undeniable. It was a world untouched by the reach of the dragons, and somewhere in that wasteland, the truth was waiting. Jacqueline zoomed into the center of the frame, the pixels fracturing into a blocky mess of gray and rust. She tapped the magnification key, forcing the hardware to re-render the distant terrain. The landscape crawled past in slow, stuttering frames. She stopped on a cluster of jagged scrap mounds. A small, dark shape moved near the base of a pile. She leaned back, eyes narrow, pulse quickening as she manually adjusted the contrast. The shape moved again, rhythmic and deliberate. It was hauling a heavy sheet of metal. Jacqueline held her breath, the terminal interface becoming a blur as her focus locked onto the screen. The figure paused, wiped a hand across its forehead, and turned toward the lens. The grainy feed sharpened for a fraction of a second, clearing the distortion of the binary suns. It was Ruby. She was breathing. She was moving. She was working in the dirt of a dead planet. The official report of her death collapsed into a pile of lies in Jacqueline's mind. She slammed her hand against the desk, the impact rattling the console. The hollow ache of mourning vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She was not gone. She was waiting, and Jacqueline would not leave her there. Jacqueline navigated the feed to a wider angle, revealing the purpose behind the scrap. Ruby was not merely surviving, she was constructing. Massive sheets of oxidized steel were bent into curved barricades, forming a circular enclosure. Within the perimeter, the ground was padded with shredded synthetic fabric. Jacqueline zoomed in on the center. A group of adults moved with the clumsy, stumbling gait of infants, their limbs oversized and their expressions vacant. They crawled through tunnels made of discarded copper pipes and sat inside hollowed-out engine casings. Ruby worked among them, her movements precise and gentle. She guided one of the adults toward a pile of soft debris, patting the ground to encourage it to sit. The scene was surreal. These were full-grown people, reduced to a state of permanent infancy, isolated on a rock orbiting two dying stars. They had no memory of their past, only the current task of navigating the metal maze Ruby had built for them. Jacqueline watched as Ruby hoisted a heavy plate, bracing it against a structural beam to expand the play area. It was a prison disguised as a refuge, a silent, bizarre sanctuary for the broken. The tragedy was absolute. Ruby was not just an exile, she was a nursemaid to a generation of ghosts. The hum of the terminal cooling fans was the only sound in the command center until the air shifted. It was not a breeze, but a subtle displacement of pressure. Jacqueline felt the change before she saw it. She reached to minimize the subdirectory, her fingers hovering over the keys, but she froze. A faint, high-pitched whine began to pulse in the room, perfectly matched to the steady, rhythmic thud of footsteps approaching from the corridor. Jacqueline pulled her hand back. A shadow stretched across the console, elongated and sharp. Lolly stepped into the doorway. Behind her, a mechanical drone drifted through the air, its altitude adjusting in exact alignment with her stride. Every time Lolly shifted her weight, the drone dipped. Every time she paused, the drone locked into place. The synchronization was absolute, a calculated echo of movement that made the machine feel like an extension of her own body. Lolly did not offer a greeting. She stood at the threshold, her posture rigid, eyes fixed on the back of Jacqueline's head. The flickering light from the terminal reflected in the polished casing of the hovering machine. Jacqueline remained motionless, her fingers still inches from the hidden logs, trapped in the sudden weight of an unwanted arrival. The drone did not merely hover. It patrolled the perimeter of the command center with a predatory intelligence. Its sensors swept the room, emitting a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse that vibrated against the metal floor. This was the mechanism of order. A second drone detached itself from the ceiling's dark recesses, dropping into the space between Jacqueline and the terminal. Its casing was seamless, reflecting the room in a distorted, metallic sheen. These machines were the silent enforcers of the Dragon laws, ensuring that no thought remained private and no action went unrecorded. The population below existed in a state of perpetual obedience, their lives curated by the constant vigilance of these hovering sentinels. Jacqueline watched as the first drone adjusted its trajectory, blocking her path to the override controls. The light from its central lens glowed with a steady, clinical intensity, a reminder that the entire city was held in this same iron grip. Every worker, every citizen, and every official moved under the weight of this invisible surveillance. To exist was to comply. The air in the room grew heavy with the sound of whirring rotors, a mechanical heartbeat that dictated the pace of life. Jacqueline felt the crushing reality of a system designed to extinguish dissent before it could even take root. Jacqueline turned. The movement was deliberate, a slow pivot that brought her face to face with the intruder. Lolly stood unmoved, her presence anchoring the room in a cold, unnatural stillness. She did not blink. Her eyes held a steady, hollow focus that seemed to bypass Jacqueline entirely, reading the data on the monitors behind her. The air between them began to hum. A sharp, erratic crackle of static electricity danced across the console, sparking against the metal edge of the terminal. The smell of ozone filled the small space, stinging the back of Jacqueline's throat. Every breath felt thin, weighted by the pressure of the drones hovering in the periphery. Lolly shifted her weight, and the sound of fabric rubbing against itself was amplified by the unnatural silence of the room. A single spark jumped from the drone to a nearby monitor, causing the display to flicker and distort. Jacqueline did not look away. She kept her posture grounded, shoulders set, meeting the gaze that offered no warmth and no mercy. The space between them became a vacuum of intent. No words were exchanged, yet the threat was absolute. They stood as two opposing forces in a room that had suddenly become too small to hold them both, waiting for the first sign of instability to break the stalemate. Jacqueline broke the standoff first, her hands slamming onto the console. She ignored the warning lights and punched a rapid sequence into the terminal. The primary firewall resisted, a wall of red code blocking her path, but she bypassed the security protocols with a harsh, decisive strike. A hidden subdirectory materialized on the screen, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. She navigated through layers of encrypted files, each one a testament to the systematic erasure of the truth. There, buried under a false flag of termination, was the reality of the Dragon laws. Ruby was not dead. She was a political asset, sequestered on a remote planet, forced into labor to sustain the very entity that claimed she had perished. Jacqueline scrolled through the logs, seeing the fabricated casualty reports and the digital ghosts left in their wake. Every piece of evidence pointed to a calculated, long-term imprisonment. The cruelty was not in the killing, but in the theft of a life. She stared at the coordinates, her jaw set, the weight of the deception pressing against her chest. The kingdom was built on this foundation of phantom deaths and silent disappearances. The truth was now clear. Ruby was a prisoner of the system, held in the dark to keep the status quo intact. Jacqueline felt the cold logic of the Dragon laws solidify in her mind, a cage with no visible bars. The truth was not enough. To dismantle the lie, Jacqueline needed to see the moment it was forged. Her eyes locked onto the time manipulation terminal, a heavy, isolated unit recessed into the command desk. She shoved the main console aside, the metal screeching against the floor. Lolly reacted instantly. The hovering drones surged forward, their red sensors sweeping the room, casting jagged light across the walls. They banked hard, intercepting Jacqueline's path, their cooling fans emitting a high-pitched whine that vibrated through the floorboards. Jacqueline ducked, sliding beneath the drone's low-altitude sweep. She slammed her palm onto the terminal's glass surface, triggering the authentication prompt. The system pulsed blue, demanding a high-level security clearance she did not possess. She reached for a bypass cable, her fingers trembling with the exertion of the chase, and jammed it into the primary port. The terminal glowed a searing white. Sparks showered the desk as the encryption layers began to strip away. She ignored the warning alarms screaming throughout the command center. Her focus narrowed to the flickering temporal coordinates. The system initiated the handshake protocol. She stood firm, her hand hovering just millimeters from the final activation sequence, ready to collapse the timeline and force the hidden truth into the light. Jacqueline pressed the activation sequence. The terminal groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the metal desk and into her bones. The room began to lose its structural integrity. Light fractured into prismatic shards, and the static from the drones turned into a low, guttural hum that pushed against her eardrums. She held her ground as the command center blurred into a smear of gray and black. The world tilted. Gravity shifted, pulling her sideways before snapping back with a violent jolt. Outside the viewport, the stars traced long, erratic arcs across the sky, moving in reverse at impossible speeds. She clung to the console, her knuckles white, watching the data streams on the walls retreat into the past. The system fought her, a torrent of temporal resistance pushing back against the override. She forced the slider backward, fighting through the thick, viscous pressure of shifting time. The air grew cold, smelling of ozone and ozone-charred copper. She watched the clock on the wall ticking rapidly backward 5 hours. 4, 3. The sensation was like falling upward through deep water. Finally, the motion slowed. The blur sharpened into a static image of the room exactly 6 hours prior. The temporal loop locked into place. The room stopped spinning. She stood in the quiet of the past, the deception still fresh and unwritten. The command center was silent, preserved in a moment before the current crisis. Jacqueline turned her gaze toward the primary monitor. The screen flickered to life, showing a live feed of the terminal from 6 hours ago. Lolly stood over the console, her movements precise and rhythmic. She was not managing order, she was scrubbing history. Jacqueline leaned in, her eyes tracing the rapid movement of Lolly's fingers across the interface. On the display, the rescue mission logs blinked into view, tagged with high priority status. Then, they vanished. Lolly tapped a secondary command, and a new file manifested in the empty space. A formal death certificate for Ruby. It was a flawless forgery, complete with digital seals and falsified coordinates. The screen distorted, a glitch rippling through the temporal playback. Jacqueline reached out, shielding the monitor with her body to block the harsh overhead glare, desperately trying to keep the evidence from dissolving. The feed stabilized just long enough for the final timestamp to lock in. Lolly saved the document, effectively erasing Ruby from the system's active roster. The deception was complete, a clean surgical strike against the truth. Jacqueline watched the reflection of the screen in the darkened glass, the weight of the orchestrated lie pressing down on her as the reality of the situation solidified. The heavy steel door at the far end of the command center groaned open. Jacqueline did not turn. She watched the screen, the evidence of the forgery still glowing in the dark room. Rain stepped inside. His boots struck the metallic grating with a rhythmic, heavy cadence that cut through the silence. He paused, his silhouette darkening the doorway before he moved deeper into the light. He approached the terminal with a measured gait, his gaze shifting from the surrounding consoles to the playback loop on the primary monitor. He stopped just feet behind Jacqueline. He did not speak. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a sudden, sharp Stillness. His eyes locked onto the screen, scanning the digital trail of the death certificate. He leaned forward, his face illuminated by the harsh blue glow of the corrupted logs. He read the lines of text twice, the flickering light casting long shadows across his features. His breathing became shallow, audible in the quiet. He looked at the timestamp, then back at the falsified files. The reality of the deception hit him with a physical force. He stood frozen, his eyes darting across the evidence, processing the collapse of the narrative he had defended for years. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the weight of the truth settled between them. Rain took a slow step backward, the sound of his boots dragging against the floor. He tried to point at the screen, but his hand faltered, shaking slightly as he pulled it back to his chest. He looked around the command center, his gaze sweeping over the consoles that had defined his life, now appearing as nothing more than instruments of a grand lie. He gripped his staff with both hands, his knuckles turning white under the pressure. The metal of the shaft felt unnaturally cold, a sharp, biting sensation that grounded him in the sudden chaos. He tightened his hold, the staff vibrating slightly against his palm as he squeezed, seeking some anchor in the collapsing reality. He did not look at Jacqueline. He stared at his own reflection in the darkened glass of a secondary monitor, his jaw set, his breathing ragged and uneven. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the hum of the cooling fans and the faint, rhythmic ticking of the terminal. He turned the staff over, his fingers tracing the grooves of the metal, the cold surface mirroring the sudden, icy clarity in his mind. He understood now. The order he had enforced, the laws he had upheld, were built on this digital rot. He took a deep, steadying breath, his grip firm and unyielding, ready to turn against the very source of his authority. Jacqueline turned away from the terminal. She did not look at Rain. Her eyes locked onto Lolly, who stood in the threshold, perfectly still. The air between them hummed with the sound of the server banks. Jacqueline reached out and tapped the screen, causing the image of the distant planet to expand and sharpen. The grainy feed resolved into a clear frame. Ruby, alive, moving scrap metal in the red light of a binary star. Jacqueline stepped to the side, clearing the view, and thrust her finger toward the monitor. She did not speak. She waited for Lolly to acknowledge the visual reality. Lolly shifted, her gaze flickering across the display, but she refused to look directly at the figure on the screen. Jacqueline pressed harder, stepping into Lolly's space, forcing the distance between them to vanish. She grabbed the edge of the console and tilted the display, pinning the image of the living survivor into the center of the room. "Look at her," Jacqueline commanded. Her voice was steady, cutting through the electronic whine of the command center. Lolly tightened her jaw. She stared at the screen, her composure fraying as the evidence of her own deception stared back. The lie was exposed, rendered in real time, leaving no room for denial. Lolly did not retreat. Instead, she raised her hand to her throat, her fingers tracing a precise, rapid pattern against the skin. A low-frequency pulse emanated from the command center floor, vibrating through the metal panels under their feet. From the dark recesses of the ceiling, two panels slid open with a sharp, pneumatic hiss. Two drones descended, their frames rotating as they locked onto the targets in the room. The red lights along their sensors pulsed in time with the room's cooling fans, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls. They hovered in place, the air around them humming with static charge. Lolly took a step forward, her movements perfectly fluid, ignoring the evidence still frozen on the screen. She gestured toward the console, and the drones responded instantly, angling their primary sensors toward Jacqueline and Rain. The red glow intensified, bathing the room in a harsh, artificial light that made the digital feed of the distant planet appear washed out. There was no hesitation in their trajectory. They drifted closer, the mechanical whir growing into a sharp, piercing whine. Lolly watched them, her eyes devoid of any flicker, as the drones adjusted their altitude to ensure total coverage of the room. The threat was no longer abstract. It was hovering 6 feet above the floor, waiting for the final instruction to strike. The two drones already in the room emitted a sharp, high-pitched frequency that resonated against the command center walls. It was a signal. Above them, the ceiling panels groaned and retracted, pulling back to expose the dark, hollow cavity of the ventilation shafts. A dozen more drones spilled out, descending like a synchronized cloud of steel and circuitry. Their rotors cut through the air with a rhythmic, heavy thrum that vibrated deep in the chest. Every surface of the room became a landing point for the machines. They clung to the overhead beams, their red sensors sweeping back and forth in a frantic, overlapping grid. The buzzing grew from a whine into a deafening, metallic roar that swallowed the room whole. Jacqueline felt the change in air pressure as the drones saturated the space, their collective heat raising the temperature of the chamber. There was no longer a path to the exit. The ceiling had been transformed into a living, buzzing ceiling of hostile intent. Each machine tracked the movement of the humans below with jerky, inhuman precision. The red glow from the swarm bled into every corner, turning the command center into a claustrophobic cage where even the shadows were being chased away by the relentless, pulsing light of the machines. Jacqueline looked up at the ceiling, but she stopped seeing the machines. She saw the geometry of the room, the reinforced walls, the lack of windows, the way the ventilation ducts were designed only to circulate air from the interior, never to the outside world. It hit her with the weight of a physical blow. This command center was not built to protect the kingdom. It was built to keep it contained. She scanned the monitors again, not for data, but for the architecture of the city itself. Every district, every street, every sector she had managed for years was laid out in concentric circles, perfectly mirroring the locking mechanism of the terminal she stood before. The entire kingdom was not a sanctuary. It was a high-security holding pen, and they were all merely inmates. The dragons had not provided a refuge. They had constructed a seamless, invisible prison. She watched the drones hover, their movements now appearing less like guards and more like wardens, pacing a cell block. The realization paralyzed her for a heartbeat. The walls were not there to keep the chaos out. They were there to keep the truth from ever breaking through to the streets below. Jacqueline lunged for the console. Her fingers slammed into the primary override sequence, but a drone dived, its chassis grazing her shoulder. She twisted, letting her weight drop to slide under the machine, and kicked back at the terminal base to stabilize herself. The screen flickered with red warnings, blocking the path to the broadcast directory. She ignored the alarms. Her pulse thundered in her ears, matching the erratic, pulsing light of the swarm. One hand gripped the terminal edge to steady her aim, while the other tapped a rapid, complex string of commands. The machines sensed the shift. They surged downward, a wall of shifting steel that threatened to pin her to the desk. She blocked one with her forearm, feeling the vibration of its rotors against her skin, and shoved it aside. The system chirped a single, clear tone cutting through the mechanical roar. The subdirectory finally unlocked. She began the data transfer, her movements precise despite the encroaching swarm. The terminal glowed white as the broadcast sequence initialized. She did not stop. She pushed the override to full capacity, forcing the connection open against the firewall, her knuckles white, her focus absolute. The final command entered the core. Jacqueline slammed her palm onto the execute key just as a drone collided with the console, sending sparks showering across the room. She did not look back. The main monitor flared to a blinding white, then stabilized into a crisp, high-resolution feed. Across the city, in every district and every public square, the terminals hummed to life in unison. The hidden coordinates of Ruby's planet bypassed the firewalls, flooding the public network with raw, undeniable proof. Jacqueline watched the status bars climb. 10%, 40, 70, complete. The data was no longer contained within the command center. It was live. Every screen in the capital now displayed the grainy, real-time footage of Ruby working under the binary stars. The illusion of her death shattered instantly. Thousands of kilometers away, the signal echoed into the city grid, forcing the truth into the sight of every citizen. Jacqueline felt the terminal vibrate under her hands as the final packet sent. The secret was out. The dragons could no longer bury the reality of the survivors. The silence in the command center was gone, replaced by the distant, rising sound of a city waking up to a lie finally dismantled. The effect was immediate and physical. Within the command center, the overhead lights pulsed, dimming to a dull orange before snapping back to full intensity. The The drones circling the ceiling lost their rhythmic flight pattern. They stuttered in mid-air, rotors whining as their link to the central authority wavered. Outside, the city grid began to protest. Street lamps flickered in rhythmic waves, mirroring the instability of the broadcast signal now saturating the network. Massive holographic banners that once projected propaganda turned to static, then vanished, leaving the streets in sudden, stark darkness. The hum of the city changed pitch, dropping from a steady drone to a discordant, erratic vibration. Jacqueline watched the power monitors. The lines were jagged, spiking as the Dragon's control system struggled to recalibrate. The infrastructure of the capital was failing, shedding its artificial order. Every public terminal remained locked on the image of the binary stars, their glow acting as a beacon of truth that the collapsing network could no longer suppress. The air in the room grew cold as the climate control system stuttered and cut out, leaving only the sound of grinding metal and the distant, growing roar of a city realizing its own liberation. Lolly stood motionless as the monitors broadcast the truth, but the mask finally slipped. The static around her hands crackled, biting into the air with a high-pitched whine. She stepped over a fallen drone, her gaze fixed entirely on the main terminal. The mechanical rhythm of her movements ceased, replaced by a sudden, predatory tension. She did not speak. She did not signal for the remaining drones to assist. Instead, she planted her feet on the vibrating floor and crouched, muscles coiled for a strike. Jacqueline reached for the override lever, but the air between them grew heavy with ozone. Lolly lunged. She covered the distance in a single blurred motion, her fingers outstretched to tear the interface from the wall. Her face was a landscape of sharp, cold fury, the shadows in the room deepening across her features. Jacqueline braced herself, leaning back against the console to protect the terminal. The distance between them closed to a matter of inches. Lolly's momentum carried her forward, a force of pure, desperate intent aimed at silencing the truth before it could take root. The sound of her boots skidding on the metal floor echoed against the sirens, as the room seemed to shrink to the space between their reaching hands. Lolly's hand slammed into the console, crushing the plastic casing just as Jacqueline's fingers danced across the secondary command array. The terminal groaned under the impact, sparks showering the floor. Jacqueline did not pull away. She drove her palm into the final override button, locking the command sequence into the core. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards, rattling the heavy equipment and forcing the remaining drones to spiral downward. The air around the terminal began to warp, bending the light into impossible, jagged angles. Lolly tried to shove Jacqueline aside, but her arms slowed, moving through air that had suddenly turned thick and viscous. A blinding, white-hot glow erupted from the terminal's base. It surged upward, swallowing the command center, the walls, and the shifting shadows. The sound of the city's sirens faded into a singular, infinite note. Jacqueline stood at the center of the flare, her hand still pressed against the interface. The room vanished behind a wall of pure, static energy. Gravity shifted. The metal floor buckled, and the light reached a peak intensity that erased the divide between the two figures, locking the command center in the instant before the impact was completed. The white light receded, leaving behind a silence that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. Time had stopped. Lolly remained suspended inches from the terminal, her fingers curled into a claw, her body angled in a desperate, forward-leaning strike that would never land. Not a single muscle fiber twitched, not a breath stirred the air. Behind her, the drones were caught in mid-descent, their red optical sensors fixed in a dull, unblinking glare, wings motionless, despite the angle of their fall. A single spark from the shattered console hung in the air, a jagged orange streak that refused to arc or fade. Jacqueline stood with her hand resting on the cooling terminal, watching the stillness spread through the room. She moved a step to the side, and the sound of her boot against the metal floor was the only vibration in the entire facility. The air felt brittle, as if a sharp noise might shatter the reality of the room into dust. She scanned the command center. Every stream of data on the screens was frozen in a jagged, interrupted flow. The rebellion was sealed. The deceiver was trapped in a perpetual second of failure, unable to retract her hand or complete her path. Outside the room, the world continued. But inside, the clock had been ripped from the wall. Light years away, the binary stars cast long twin shadows over the jagged landscape of scrap. Ruby sat on the ground, her hands coated in metallic dust, sorting through twisted girders and rusted plates. The rhythm of her work was steady, a repetitive clanking of metal against metal that had defined her existence for cycles. Then, the air grew thin. The hum of the atmosphere, usually a low, constant vibration, spiked into a sharp, piercing frequency. Ruby dropped a heavy iron rod. It hit the ground with a dull thud, but the sound did not echo as it usually did. Instead, the noise seemed to be swallowed by the horizon. She stood up, her boots crunching into the loose debris. The twin stars above flickered, their steady light wavering for a heartbeat before stabilizing into a deeper, cooler hue. She looked toward the sky, her neck muscles taut. The wind died completely, leaving a vacuum of sound so absolute it felt like a physical weight against her skin. Something fundamental had snapped in the fabric of the world. She reached out, pressing her palm against the jagged edge of a cooling turbine, feeling a faint, rhythmic pulse throbbing through the steel. The signal had finally reached her. Across the city, the massive public terminals hissed. The constant stream of golden light, which had illuminated the streets for generations, sputtered. The flicker was rhythmic, then erratic, then dead. Citizens stopped in their tracks. A woman dropped a crate of supplies. It shattered against the pavement, but she did not look down. She looked at the terminal. The face of the authority, once projected in high-definition brilliance, dissolved into static and gray noise. The silence in the city was not a lack of sound, but a lack of instructions. People stood in the middle of thoroughfares, their hands hanging at their sides, waiting for a command that never came. A man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the empty screen, and then he looked at his neighbor. For the first time, they were not looking at the sky or the machines. They were looking at each other. The weight of the world, once carried by the unseen, settled onto their own shoulders. They shifted their weight, stretched their limbs, and began to move toward one another. The false guidance had vanished, leaving only the raw, unscripted reality of a population finally standing on its own feet. No one spoke. They simply waited to see who would take the first step. Jacqueline did not hesitate. She walked to the central console, the surface still humming with the residual static of the time loop. She jammed a heavy metal lever into the seam of the main casing and pried. The metal groaned and popped, exposing a nest of fiber optic cables and glowing conduits. With a sharp tug, she ripped the primary power coupling from its housing. Sparks showered the floor, hitting the tiles with tiny, sizzling pops. The screens in the room flickered one last time and plunged into absolute darkness. She did not stop there. She grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor and swung it into the core processor. The glass shattered, sending shards skittering across the room. She struck again, smashing the delicate circuitry until the unit was nothing but a heap of crushed plastic and mangled wire. The hum that had permeated the room for years vanished, replaced by the sound of her own ragged breathing. She dropped the wrench. It clattered against the floor, a final, definitive sound. She pulled the remaining wires from the wall, leaving the terminal a hollow, useless shell. The tools of control were destroyed. She stepped back, wiped her hands on her legs, and looked at the ruin of the machine. It would never turn on again. Jacqueline walked out of the command center, the heavy steel door groaning shut behind her. The corridor was cold and stripped of its artificial light. She stepped into the main plaza, where the air felt thinner without the hum of the drones. The city was quiet, but it was a living, breathing silence. Groups of people were gathered around the dark public terminals, some touching the glass as if expecting a flicker to return. They did not find one. Jacqueline walked past them. A man knelt to pick up a discarded tool, his movements deliberate. Nearby, a woman organized a pile of scrap metal, stacking it into a stable base for a shelter. They were no longer waiting for instructions from the sky. They were clearing the debris. Jacqueline reached the edge of the plaza and stood on the rising ground, overlooking the city. Below, the streets were filling with activity. People were checking water lines, inspecting building foundations, and talking to their neighbors. The dragon's influence had left a void, but it was being filled by the steady rhythm of manual labor. There were no more projections, no more lies, and no more hollow promises. Only the sun climbing over the horizon and the work that lay ahead. She took a deep breath, turned away from the command center, and walked into the crowd to join the effort.